The chandeliers above the Drake Foundation's grand ballroom sparkled like captured stars, casting fractured beams of light over a sea of tuxedos, silk gowns, and champagne flutes. The air hummed with the kind of polite chatter that sounded rehearsed, the kind where the words were more about positioning than connection. Nathaniel Drake had been to more of these. At 32, he was no stranger to commanding a room. Founder and CEO of Drake Systems, a global tech powerhouse valued at over $12 billion, he had learned early that presence mattered just as much as performance. The crisp line of his Italian suit, the platinum C. Tonight, he was here because his publicist had told him to be. The gala's stated purpose raising funds for literacy programs in underserved communities was a worthy cause, one Nathaniel had no objection to supporting. But he also knew, with a cynical edge, that for most of the attendees, the cause was secondary to the photo opportunities. A city councilman had cornered him near the Champagne Tower, droning on about municipal bond yields. Nathaniel nodded at appropriate intervals, his mind already plotting a graceful escape. And then he saw her. She was nowhere near the center of the room, not framed in the glare of photographers or engaged in animated conversation with power brokers. Instead, she sat alone at a table tucked into a quiet corner, a slim paperback balanced in her hands. Her long, dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and the navy dress she wore simple, unpretentious lying in ways that suggested elegance without extravagance. Round her, the gala roared with music and chatter. Round her, it seemed to dim to a low, respectful hush. Nathaniel found himself staring before he realized it. She smiled faintly at something in her book, the expression transforming her face into something almost luminous. It was genuinely devoid of the performative sparkle he was used to seeing in these circles. It was real. He didn't excuse himself from the councilman so much as abandon the conversation mid-sentence, striding toward her with an uncharacteristic sense of purpose. When he reached her table, she looked up. Warm brown eyes met his, eyes that were calm yet alert, like they missed nothing and judged little. For the first time in years, Nathaniel's usual polished charm didn't leap automatically to his lips. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his voice a touch lower than he'd intended. "I'm Nathaniel Drake." She placed a napkin between the pages and set the book down gently, as though even the act of pausing her reading deserved care. "Elena Marquez," she replied, her voice carrying a soft musicality, colored by a faint Spanish lilt. "You're not interrupting at all. I was just taking a break from all the noise." Nathaniel glanced at the cover, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. "That's not exactly like gala fare." "It's my third time reading it," she said, smiling faintly. "I find something new each time." Her hands rested lightly on the book, elegant fingers with short, practical nails, and a small writer's callus on her middle finger. Not the manicured perfection he saw in most women at these events, yet infinitely more captivating. "A fellow literature lover," Nathaniel said. "That's rare in my world." Her brow quirked. "And what is your world?" "Tech," he admitted, "though I did study comparative literature once upon a time, before I got swept up in code and capital." It wasn't something he mentioned often. It didn't fit the self-made billionaire image he allowed the media to cultivate. But for some reason, he wanted her to know. She tilted her head, as though filing that detail away. "Would you like to sit?" He didn't hesitate. "If you're sure I'm not intruding." "You're not." Nathaniel lowered himself into the chair across from her, acutely aware of how unusual this was for him to bypass the expected rounds of handshakes and networking for an unplanned conversation with someone who hadn't sought him out. "What brings you here tonight?" he asked. "I work at the Central Library downtown," she said. "Our adult literacy program receives funding from the organization hosting this gala. They gave me a ticket as a thank you. I help teach adults to read." It was so simple, so quietly noble, that he found himself leaning in. "That must be incredibly rewarding work." "It is," she said, and her eyes lit up not the sparkle of a diamond catching light, but the kind of warmth that glows from within. There's nothing quite like watching someone write their own name for the first time. You can almost see the doorways opening for them in that moment. As they spoke, Nathaniel forgot to check his phone. He forgot the polite laughter and the measured compliments. He forgot, even, that people were watching him because Eleanor wasn't. She wasn't dazzled by his presence, and she didn't angle for his attention like others did. She simply existed in her own calm gravity, and somehow he found himself orbiting it. She told him about growing up in a small Northern California town, where her grandmother taught her to paint watercolors, and her father, a mechanic, taught her to fix anything with moving parts. She had moved to San Francisco 3 years ago to attend library school and had stayed for the job at the Central Library. When she asked about him, he found himself answering honestly, without the usual strategic omissions. "I started coding when I was 12, he said. "My parents thought it was a phase, but I loved the idea that you could build something from nothing, that you could create an entire world just by arranging symbols in the right order. Like writing," she said softly. "Simple elements, infinite possibility." "Exactly," he smiled. "I've never thought of it that way." They stayed in conversation through the arrival of dinner service, through polite interruptions from people who wanted to shake Nathaniel's hand, through the background swell of music and clinking glasses. When he asked if she'd like some air, she agreed without hesitation. The ballroom's terrace opened to the bay, city lights dancing on the water like scattered stars. Elena leaned on the stone balustrade, breathing in the cool night air. "It's beautiful," she said. "It is," he agreed, though he was looking at her profile against the glow of the city. After a long, comfortable silence, she turned toward him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why are you here? Not just this gallery. Do you come to events like this at all?" "You could be anywhere." He considered that. "Honestly, because my assistant puts them on my calendar, and I go through the motions." But tonight he hesitated, then decided on the truth. "Tonight I'm glad I came, because I met you." Her gaze searched his, as if weighing the sincerity. "You don't know anything about me. I know enough to want to." His voice was steady now. "I know you care about teaching people to read. I know you've read that book 3 times and still find magic in it. I know you don't care about status, and I know you blush when you get a real compliment." He stepped a fraction closer, his tone gentle. "And those are important things to know." She didn't move away. When the gala wound down, Nathaniel wasn't ready to say goodbye. "Would you have coffee with me? Somewhere quieter, where we can actually hear ourselves think?" She hesitated, and he sensed it wasn't coyness, but genuine consideration. "We're from very different worlds," she said. "Which is exactly why it would be interesting," he countered. "The best conversations happen between people from different worlds." Her lips curved into a slow smile. "There is a little place near the library, Luna's Cafe. Best coffee in the city, worst Wi-Fi in the hemisphere." "Perfect," he said. "Tomorrow at 2? "Tomorrow at 2, she agreed. When Elena's rideshare pulled away, Nathaniel remained on the hotel steps longer than necessary, watching the taillights disappear. For the first time in years, his anticipation for tomorrow had nothing to do with closing a deal or sealing a partnership. It was simpler, stranger, and far more compelling. He didn't yet know that this evening would unravel and rebuild parts of him he thought unchangeable. All he knew was that he wanted to see her gain it because of who she was on paper, but because of how she made him feel in the quiet between words. And that was rare enough to matter. Luna's Cafe was exactly as Eleanor had described for him, welcoming and untouched by the city's constant churn toward modernization. The scent of fresh coffee beans mingled with cinnamon and baked bread, wrapping round Nathaniel like a comforting blanket the moment he stepped inside. Outside, the midday San Francisco streets bustled with delivery trucks, cyclists, and office workers clutching paper cups. Inside, time felt slower. It was 1:45, and Nathaniel was already there. Punctuality was not his default motto. His schedule was usually a delicate balancing act of late arrivals and early departures, but he didn't want Eleanor walking in first and scanning for him. He wanted to be here, ready, the way you are when something matters. The small space was lined with mismatched bookshelves, their contents clearly donated and well-read. A faded Persian rug anchored the seating area, where worn armchairs sat beside tiny tables adorned with vases of fresh flowers. The air hummed softly with acoustic guitar music from unseen speakers. Nathaniel chose a corner table by the window. From here, he could watch both the street and the cafe door, and realized with a faint smile, could imagine this place as part of Elena's daily life. At exactly 2 o'clock, she walked in. Sunlight followed her through the open door, catching the loose tendrils of hair escaping her ponytail. She wore a soft yellow sundress and carried a canvas tote that was heavy enough to make him wonder it contained half the library's collection. When she spotted him, her smile came easily, and something in his chest shifted. "You're early," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I was eager," he admitted without hesitation. He stood just long enough to pull out her chair. "Such a gentleman," she teased lightly. "I ordered the house blend for both of us," he said, nodding toward the counter. "You called it the best coffee in the city, and I wanted to see if you were right." As if on cue, an older woman emerged from behind the counter with 2 steaming mugs. She had weathered brown skin, kind eyes, and an air of quiet authority. "Elena Marquez," she said warmly, setting the cups down. "You've brought a friend." "Luna, this is Nathaniel Drake," Elena said. "Nathaniel, meet Luna, who runs this place and makes miracles," in a mug. Luna's gaze swept over him, lingering on the watch at his wrist, the immaculate fit of his shirt. "You treat my Eleanor with respect." "Yes, ma'am," Nathaniel said seriously, meeting her eyes without flinching. She studied him for a beat, then gave a satisfied nod. "Good. Enjoy your coffee." With that, she patted Elena's shoulder and disappeared back to the counter. "She's protective," Elena said with fond amusement. "I've been coming here almost every day since I moved to the city. Luna's like a second grandmother." Nathaniel lifted his cup. "Then I'll consider her approval and honor." The coffee was rich, deep, with just enough bitterness to be grounding. "You might be right about this place," he conceded after a sip. They settled into an easy rhythm, the outside world fading. Nathaniel found himself telling Elena things he rarely admitted, even to himself. He spoke about the isolating nature of his success. It was difficult to know if people wanted his company or his connections. "It's lonely sometimes," he said quietly. "I have business associates, employees, people who want things from me, but genuine friends, people I can trust, that's rare." Elena's eyes softened, not with pity, but with understanding. "I don't know your world," she said, "but I know loneliness. When I first moved here, I didn't know anyone. The library became my safe place. The people I met there, students, volunteers, colleague Wesley, became my family." She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a warmth through him that felt almost disorienting. Over the next few weeks, their conversation spilled into other corners of the city. Nathaniel adjusted his schedule in ways his assistant barely recognized. He ended board meetings early to meet Elena for lunch. He canceled corporate dinners to attend poetry readings at the library. He even volunteered one evening at the community center where she taught adult literacy. Watching her with her students was humbling. She celebrated small victories with the kind of joy most people reserve for life-changing milestones. "Mrs. Rodriguez read an entire paragraph today," she told him one evening, her voice bright with pride as they walked through Gold and Gate Park. "She's been working toward that for 3 months." "You really love what you do," Nathaniel said. "How can you not love helping someone unlock their own potential?" Elena stopped to admire a bed of roses in full bloom. "Reading opens doors to every other possibility in life." Her words stayed with him. For years, his company had focused on innovation, efficiency, market dominance. He had thought of technology in terms of systems, not people. Eleanor made him see the human-sided Mrs. Rodriguez's of the world and he began to wonder what Drake's systems could do beyond profit margins. One Friday evening, he invited her to dinner at an exclusive restaurant overlooking the bay. The MacD recognized him instantly and guided them to the best table in the house. "This is beautiful," Elena said, glancing at the glittering skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "But it feels a bit formal. Would you prefer somewhere else?" he asked, ready to abandon the reservation entirely. She hesitated, then smiled. "There's a little taqueria in my neighborhood. Miguel, the owner, makes the best carnitas you'll ever taste." 20 minutes later, they were sitting at a plastic table under fluorescent lights, mariachi music drifting from an old radio. Nathaniel had never enjoyed a meal more. "Tell me about your family," he said, watching her expertly fold a taco. "My parents still live in the town where I grew up," she said. "My father runs an auto repair shop. My mother teaches third grade. They've been married 30 years and still hold hands when they walk together." "That sounds rare," Nathaniel said quietly. "It is. They taught me that love isn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It's about showing up every day, in small ways, through the easy seasons and the hard ones." He thought of his own parents' divorce host success, and ambition had pulled them in opposite directions. He had never seen the kind of enduring commitment Eleanor described. "They must be proud of you," he said. "They are," she said with a smile. "But they worry about me living in the city alone. They raised me with traditional values. Family, faith, commitment. Those things matter to them. And to you," Nathaniel guessed. Her gaze met his, steady and direct. "Yes, very much." By the time autumn settled over San Francisco, Nathaniel realized he was falling for her with the shallow thrill of infatuation, but with a depth that startled him. She challenged him, inspired him, and made him laugh in a way that felt unforced. One rainy afternoon, she invited him to her apartment. It was small but warm, filled with books, potted plants, and watercolor paintings by her grandmother. They sat by the window drinking tea, and she showed him a leather-bound notebook filled with her poetry. "These are beautiful," he said after reading a few. "I've never shown them to anyone before," she admitted. "Someday I'd love to publish a collection about the immigrant experience, honoring where we come from while celebrating where we're going." "You should," he said. "I could connect you with publishers." "Thank you," she said gently. "But if it happens, I want it to happen because the work is good enough, not because of who I know." Her integrity humbled him. In his world, influence opened doors. Elena insisted on earning her way. One evening, as they walked along the waterfront, Nathaniel stopped and took her hands. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her expression shifted, weary but open. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "Actually, I think I already have. You've changed how I see everything, Mizulf. My work, the world." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. "I love you too, Nathaniel. I tried to fight it because we're so different, but I can't anymore." They kissed, slow and certain, as the fog rolled in from the bay. "There's something you should know about me," she said when they parted. "I take relationships seriously. I don't date casually or give my heart lightly. When I commit, it's for the long term." "I want that too," Nathaniel said without hesitation. She searched his face for a long moment, then nodded. "There's more. I've been saving myself for marriage. Completely. That's important to me." Nathaniel felt his chest tighten with discomfort, but with something closer to reverence. "That makes you even more extraordinary to me," he said. "Thank you for trusting me with that." 6 months after that first meeting at the charity gala, Nathaniel knew with a certainty he'd never felt about anything else who wanted to marry Elena Marquez. The realization hadn't come as a sudden revelation, but rather like the slow and steady filling of a well. Every moment with her had deepened something inside him. The way she greeted the elderly patrons at the library by name, the way she listened without judgment, the way she laughed with her whole heart. She had become woven into the fabric of his days until the thought of a life without her felt incomplete. Nathaniel had always approached big decisions with calculation tainting risk, weighing reward, predicting outcomes. But this wasn't a decision in the traditional sense. This was instinct. This was truth. He wanted a life with her, planning the perfect question. He could have proposed in 100 extravagant waistline dinners, luxury getaways, public displays that would be splashed across glossy magazines. But Elena's values had become his compass. He knew she would prefer something intimate and meaningful, something rooted in their history rather than his wealth. That's how he decided on Luna's Cafe, the place where they'd shared their first coffee and where their connection had shifted from chance encounter to something deeper. For weeks, Nathaniel planned in secret. He spoke to Luna herself, who clasped his hands and declared, "We'll make it perfect." Hi Joe. Together they chose a quiet Sunday evening when the cafe would normally be closed. Nathaniel had the space-transforming candles on every table, vases of white roses, Elena's favorite, and soft guitar music playing in the background. He rehearsed what he would say, though he knew his heart would likely override any script. The evening arrives. When Ellen arrived, she was expecting just another casual coffee date. She stepped through the cafe door in a simple cream sweater and jeans, her hair loose over her shoulders. But when she saw the transformation candles, the roses, the warm golden light froze just inside the doorway. "Nathaniel," she breathed. "What is all this?" He smiled, rising from his seat in the center of the room. "A way of asking you the most important question of my life." Her hand lifted to her mouth as he reached into his jacket and produced a small velvet box. Then, in a single fluid motion, he was kneeling before her. "Elena Marquez," he began, his voice steady, but threaded with emotion. "You've taught me what real love looks like. You've shown me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or success, but in connection, trust, and purpose. Before I met you, my life was full, but it wasn't whole. You've changed that. You've changed me. Will you marry me?" Her eyes brimmed with tears. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then louder, her smile radiant through her tears. "Yes, Nathaniel. Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a vintage-style setting with a single brilliant diamond encircled by smaller stones that caught the candlelight like starlight. The moment his hand brushed hers, she pulled him up into an embrace, her arms tight around his neck. From behind the counter, Luna appeared with a bottle of champagne, already wiping at her eyes. "I've been waiting weeks to open this," she said, grinning through her tears. Salad to the happy couple, meeting the family. In the weeks that followed, life became a whirlwind of wedding preparations. Nathaniel had anticipated some resistance from Elena's family after all. He was a billionaire CEO from a world far removed from theirs, but his fears dissolved the moment he met them. Her parents, Maria and Antonio Marquez, welcomed him with a warmth that surprised him. They lived in a modest, but beautifully kept home in the small town where Eleanor had grown up. In the kitchen, Maria served him homemade empanadas, while Antonio gave him a firm handshake that carried both respect and expectation. Later, while Elena was showing her mother the ring, Antonio motioned for Nathaniel to join him in the backyard. "You make my daughter happy," Antonio said, his voice calm but unwavering. "That is all that matters to me. But remember, happiness is not something that just happens. It's something you create together every single day." "Yes, sir," Nathaniel said sincerely. "I understand." Antonio studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good." The wedding, they decided on a ceremony in the historic Mission Church in Elena's hometown, the one where her parents had been married 30 years earlier. The reception would be held in her parents' rose garden, a place Elena had loved since childhood. Eleanor wore her grandmother's restored lace gown, delicate and timeless. Nathaniel had seen her in couture and designer gowns at formal events, but nothing compared to how she looked walking down the aisle toward him in that dress, soft sunlight filtering through the church windows, her eyes fixed on his. They exchanged vows they had written themselves. Hers spoke of trust and partnership, of choosing each other through every season. His spoke of gratitude for her patience, her honesty, and her willingness to see past the walls he had built around himself. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Nathaniel kissed her with the surety of a man who knew he had found the one thing he would never take for granted. The reception overflowed with music, laughter, and dancing under strings of warm lights in the garden. Business associates from Nathaniel's world looked faintly bewildered by the modest setting. But he didn't care. This day wasn't about image. It was about the beginning of a life together. The honeymoon. For their honeymoon, Nathaniel chose a private eco-resort in Costa Rica, secluded villas surrounded by rainforest, each with a terrace overlooking the Pacific. It was a place where the only schedules were sunrise and sunset, where the soundtrack was waves and bird calls instead of phone alerts and meeting reminders. On their first evening there, they sat together on the terrace, the sky ablaze with colors too vivid for photographs to capture. Eleanor was quiet, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Are you all right, Mrs. Drake?" Nathaniel asked gently, using her new name for the first time. She smiled at the sound of it, then hesitated. "I'm happy, just a little nervous." Nervous, she drew a breath. About tonight, about being intimate for the first time. He reached for her hands. "Elena, we don't have to do anything you're not ready for. We have our whole lives ahead of us. I want to be with you," she said softly, "but I need you to know I've never been with anyone before, at all." Nathaniel's heart tightened, not with disappointment, but with horror. He'd known about her values, but hearing her confirm that she had saved herself completely for marriage stirred something deep inside him. "You're telling me I'm your first?" he asked gently. She nodded, her cheeks warming. "My first, my only. I hope that doesn't disappoint me." He cupped her face tenderly. "Elena, I've never been more honored in my life. The fact that you've chosen to share that part of yourself with me, it's the most precious gift anyone has ever given me." The sound of the waves was the only music as the last blush of sunset faded into the velvet of night. The rainforest surrounding their villa seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew something sacred was about to happen. Nathaniel stood on the terrace, Elena's hands in his, their chairs forgotten behind them. "Elena," he said softly, "there's no rush. Tonight is about you, about us. We go at your pace." Her brown eyes so warm, instead searched his face as if memorizing every line. "I trust you, Nathaniel, completely." The weight of those words pressed into him, not with burden, but with an honor that made his chest tighten. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without a flicker of nerves, yet here he was, feeling almost unsteady in the presence of her vulnerability. The first steps. Inside, the villa glowed with low golden lamplight. Nathaniel moved slowly, never letting go of her hand. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked, giving her space to steady herself. "Just water," she said with a smile that trembled around the edges. He poured it for her, watching the way she took a slow sip, then set the glass down like a deliberate gesture ready. Nathaniel brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." She let out a soft laugh. "You've probably said that before." "Not like this," he said, and she heard the truth in his voice. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, almost tentative. She returned the kiss shyly, as if tasting something new, her hand coming up to rest lightly against his chest. The pace of patience, every movement that followed was unhurried. He let her explore him as much as he explored her, kissing her fingertips, the inside of her wrist, feeling the rapid flutter of her pulse. She traced the line of his jaw with the same care she might use on the fragile edge of a page in a rare book. They spoke in whispers about how it felt, about what they wanted, about what was okay, and what could wait. Nathaniel marveled at how natural it felt to talk like this, to keep her comfort as the center of everything. When they finally crossed the threshold of that last unshared intimacy, it wasn't with the practiced ease of experience, but with the rawness of two people building something entirely new together. Elena's breath caught in wonder, her eyes glistening. "Nathaniel," he stilled immediately. "Are you okay?" She nodded, smiling through the shimmer of tears. "Better than okay. I never knew it could feel so connected." The transformation. They moved together slowly, as if learning a dance that had no choreography but instinct. Every sound she made, every shift of her body, guided him. It wasn't about performance or perfection, it was about presence. For Nathaniel, it was unlike anything he'd ever known. In the past, intimacy had been a transaction of attraction, pleasure exchanged without depth. But this was a surrender. She wasn't just giving him her body, was giving him her trust, her history, her future. When it was over, they stayed tangled together, the moonlight streaming through the open balcony doors. Elena's fingers traced idle patterns over his chest, her breathing slowing in sync with his. I feel like we've truly become one person, she murmured. Nathaniel kissed the top of her head. That's because we have. Morning light. He woke before her, the pale gold of dawn spilling across the bed. For a long moment, he just watched her sleep, her hair spread across the pillow, her lips slightly parted, her hand resting over his heart. Slipping out of bed, he stepped onto the terrace. The air was cool, carrying the scent of salt and hibiscus. Somewhere in the trees, a bird began to sing. Nathaniel closed his eyes and let the moment settle inside him. He understood something now, something he hadn't even realized he'd been missing. All the relationships before this had been missing the courage to be completely vulnerable, to give without holding back. Elena had given him that courage. A quiet breakfast. When she emerged from the bedroom wrapped in a silk robe, she was glowing in a way that made his breath catch all over again. "Good morning, Mrs. Drake," he said, grinning. "Good morning, my amazing husband," she replied, leaning in to kiss him. They ate breakfast on the terrace, fresh papaya, mango, eggs, and coffee so rich it seemed almost sweet. At one point, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Last night," she said softly, "was more beautiful than I ever imagined. I was nervous, but you made me feel safe." Nathaniel swallowed against the surge of emotion in his throat. "You've given me the most precious gift anyone ever could. I promise I'll spend every day of our marriage honoring it, honoring you." Days in paradise. The rest of the honeymoon unfolded like a dream. They explored rainforest trails hand in hand, swam in hidden lagoons where the water was the color of jade, and lay in hammocks for hours, reading passages of poetry aloud to each other. Nathaniel found himself telling her things he'd never told another person about: his fears, his doubts, his moments of regret. She listened without judgment, just as she did with her library patrons, but with an intimacy that made him feel completely known. One afternoon, walking barefoot along a stretch of secluded beach, he stopped and faced her. "Elena," he said, "I want to do something different with my life. I want to take what I've built and use it to create something that matters: education programs, literacy centers, opportunities for people who've never had them." Her eyes softened. "That sounds wonderful, but only if it's what you truly want, not just something you're doing for me. It's for us," Nathaniel said firmly, "for the life we're building together. You've shown me that success without purpose is empty. I don't want my legacy to be just numbers and buildings. I want it to be lives changed." Looking ahead, on their last night in Costa Rica, they sat watching the sun sink into the Pacific, the horizon painted in fire and gold. Elena leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "We're going to have a good life, Nathaniel," she said quietly. He turned to kiss her hair. "The best life, because it's ours." They fell asleep that night with the windows open to the sound of the ocean, the air warm and sweet, the future stretching out before them like the endless water vista, full of promise. And theirs to navigate together. The plane touched down in San Francisco, under a sky painted with the muted grays of an early spring afternoon. Nathaniel glanced across the aisle at Elena, who was gazing out the window with a soft smile. There was a glow about her, still a quiet radiance from their days in Costa Rica that he found himself wanting to protect at all costs. "You ready to see our new home?" he asked as the passengers stood to retrieve their bags. Her eyes sparkled. "More than ready. It still feels unreal." The house that was theirs. 2 days after their wedding, Nathaniel had told her he didn't want them living in his penthouse. It was sleek and impressive, but it wasn't theirs. It was a monument to the man he had been before her. "I want a place we choose together," he'd said. "Somewhere we can build from scratch, with our fingerprints on every corner. They'd found it after only a week of searching. A craftsman-style house in Pacific Heights. Its wide porch framed by climbing roses, and its front windows looking out over the bay. The floors were oak, worn just enough to give the rooms a lived-in warmth. And there was a library off the living room that had made Elena's eyes light up the moment she stepped inside. No, as they pushed open the front door for the first time as husband and wife, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings greeted them. Nathaniel set their suitcases by the stairs and pulled her into his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Drake." She laughed softly against his chest. "It's perfect. Even without the furniture, it already feels like us." Days of unpacking, nights of dreaming. The first week was a blur of cardboard boxes, takeout containers, and the satisfying ache of building something tangible together. Elena unpacked the kitchen with methodical care, arranging spices and dishes as if she'd been cooking there for years. Nathaniel focused on the library, installing custom shelves and surprising her by leaving space for a writing desk. "I thought this corner would be good for you," he said one evening, gesturing toward the desk now nestled between two tall windows. "A place to write your poetry, or anything else you want." Her throat tightened. "You remembered." "I remember everything you tell me," he said simply, and it was true. At night, they collapsed onto the couch, still the only piece of furniture in the living room, curling under a blanket with mugs of tea. They talked about everything from favorite childhood memories to the names they'd choose if they ever had children. The first project together, 3 weeks after moving in, Nathaniel called Elena into the library. Spread across the desk were architectural sketches, budget breakdowns, and photographs of community centers from around the country. "I've been thinking about what we talked about on the beach in Costa Rica," he began, "about using what I have to make a difference." She leaned over the desk, studying the papers. "This is a literacy center, the first of many," he confirmed. "I want to start in the Mission District. There is an old municipal building we could renovate, techless rooms for reading programs, space for job training, maybe even a small gallery for local artists." Elena's hand rested on the edge of the desk. "Nathaniel, this is exactly the kind of place that could change lives. And you want me to run it with me?" He finished. "Your vision, my resources. We can hire the best teachers, the best staff, but the heart of it will be yours." Her eyes filled. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Meeting the Rivers. Spring had deepened into May when they made the trip to Elena's hometown to see her parents. Nathaniel had met Maria and Javier Rivera briefly before the wedding. But this was different. This was a weekend in their world. The Rivers' home was a modest stucco house with a garden that seemed to spill over with roses, marigolds, and the heady scent of jasmine. Maria met them at the door with a warm embrace for both. Javier's handshake was firm, but there was a spark of humor in his dark eyes. Over dinner, homemade tamales, rice, and beans seasoned with Maria's magic, Javier asked the kind of questions Nathaniel wasn't used to. Not about profits or expansions, but about values. "What makes you proudest in your life?" Javier asked, watching him closely. Nathaniel thought about it, then glanced at Elena. "That I was smart enough to marry your daughter." Javier chuckled, but there was approval in his nod. "A good answer. But remember, pride is easy when things are new. Real pride comes from how you show up when life isn't simple." Nathaniel understood. It was both blessing and warning. The ribbon cutting. By late summer, the Mission District Literacy Center was ready. Nathaniel had poured resources into the building's renovation, but it was Elena's vision that had shaped its heart. The classrooms were painted in warm colors, the shelves stocked with books for every age and reading level. In one corner, a mural depicted an open book whose pages transformed into wings, carrying a figure into the sky. On opening day, neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, music playing from a local band. Eleanor stood with the ceremonial scissors in hand, her parents in the front row. Nathaniel, standing beside her, felt a swell of pride so deep it surprised him. "This center exists because of one belief," Elena said into the microphone, "that education is not a privilege, it's a right. We hope this will be a place where doors open, where dreams begin, and where every voice is heard. The crowd erupted in applause as she cut the ribbon. Nathaniel leaned down to whisper, "I've never been prouder of anything in my life." A quiet conversation. That night, after the celebration, they walked through the now quiet center. The air still carried the scent of fresh paint and new books. "You did this," Nathaniel said, turning her gently to face him. "You dreamed it into being." "We did this," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "You've changed me, Elena. The man I was before you." He measured success in numbers and acquisitions. "Now I measure it in faces. In moments like today." She smiled softly. "That's because you finally let yourself be known. And when you let people in, Nathaniel, you give them a gift too." Looking toward tomorrow. By autumn, the house in Pacific Heights felt fully lived in. The library was Elena's sanctuary. The kitchen smelled often of whatever new recipe she was trying, and the porch was Nathaniel's favorite place to read in the early morning while she still slept. One evening, as the leaves turned gold outside their windows, Elena set down her tea and took his hand. "I've been thinking," she said, "about starting a family. Not right this minute, but soon." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. "You mean?" She nodded, her eyes warm. "I'd like to have a child with you." He kissed her hand, his chest tightening with a joy so strong it almost hurt. "Nothing would make me happier." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, both imagining the life ahead not as a vague dream, but as something close enough to touch. The first winter in their new home was one of quiet routines and unspoken anticipation. Nathaniel often found Eleanor curled up in the library with a notebook, her pen moving steadily as she worked on a collection of poems she'd been too shy to share with anyone but him. Outside, Pacific Heights shimmered with strings of white holiday lights, but inside their walls, the glow came from something warmer and understanding that they were building a life designed not just for the present, but for decades ahead. The decision. It happened one cold December morning, as the rain pattered gently against the kitchen windows. Eleanor was making oatmeal, humming softly to herself, when she glanced at Nathaniel over her shoulder. "I've been thinking," she said, sliding his coffee across the counter. "Maybe we don't have to wait so long." He set down the newspaper. "For what?" "For a baby," she said, her cheeks flushing with a mix of excitement and nerves. Nathaniel's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that his heart was already there. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure I want to try," she replied. "Life feels right for it. And I can still manage the literacy center." Marisol's been doing an incredible job as assistant director. "It wouldn't all fall on me." He reached across the counter to take her hand. "Then let's do it. Let's make a family." An unexpected visit. They didn't tell anyone it yet. It felt like a secret too sacred to share. But a week later, that privacy was interrupted by a figure from Nathaniel's past. It was a Tuesday afternoon when his assistant called from the gate. "There's a woman here insisting she won't leave without speaking to you." When Nathaniel walked into the foyer, the sight of her made his stomach tighten. Miranda Call, a former Flamethou Flame, was too generous a word for what they'd been. She'd been part of his old life, the world of exclusive galas and transactional relationships. "Miranda," he said evenly, "what brings you here?" She offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I thought I'd deliver my congratulations in person. I see the rumors are true. You've married a librarian." Elena entered just then, a soft cardigan round her shoulders, her expression open but cautious. "Hello, I'm Elena." Miranda's gaze flicked over her, quick and assessing. "Yes, I've heard." Nathaniel's new muse. The condescension in her tone made something sharp rise in Nathaniel's chest. "Why are you here, Miranda?" "Because," she said, stepping forward, "I have an investment opportunity for you, one that could multiply your portfolio tenfold. And frankly, it's a shame to see you wasting your resources on charity projects." A line in the sand. It was Eleanor who spoke next, her voice calm but firm. "Those charity projects change lives. I've seen it every day. If that's what you call wasting resources, I suppose we have very different definitions of success. Nathaniel's pride in her swelled. He turned back to Miranda. You heard my wife. I'm not interested. Miranda's smile turned brittle. Careful, Nathaniel. You used to be sharper about these things. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. I've never been clearer, he said. Goodbye, Miranda. When she finally left, Eleanor turned to him, searching his face. You didn't have to defend me like that. But thank you. You're my wife, he said simply. You'll never stand alone while I'm beside you. The waiting, January passed with slow, hopeful days. Every time Elena felt a twinge or a flutter, she glanced at Nathaniel, and he'd know exactly what she was wondering. They didn't talk about it constantly, but it lived between the more gentle hum of expectation. By February, the answer came. Nathaniel was in his study when he heard her footsteps, quicker than usual. She appeared in the doorway, holding a small white stick, her eyes wide and shimmering. Nathaniel, we're going to have a baby. He crossed the room into strides, lifting her into his arms. The joy was overwhelming, almost dizzying. You've just given me the best news of my life. Protecting what's theirs. The news brought a new kind of vigilance. Nathaniel insisted on driving her to and from the literacy center. Even on days when she swore she felt fine, Elena teased him about being overprotective, but she also held his hand a little tighter each time they crossed the street. One afternoon, while she was leading a workshop at the center, Nathaniel overheard two board members speaking near the coffee station. She's sweet, one murmured. But do you really think she has the stamina for this now? Running a center and being pregnant? The comment was meant to be private, but it lodged under Nathaniel's skin like a thorn. That night, he told Eleanor what he'd heard, half expecting her to be hurt. Instead, she smiled faintly. Then I'll just have to prove them wrong. I've been underestimated before, Nathaniel. This is nothing new. A new vision. By early spring, Elena was beginning to show, and the sight of her curved belly under a flowing blouse, hair pulled back, eyes bright stirred something fierce and tender in Nathaniel. One evening, as they walked through the garden, she stopped by the trellis where the roses were just beginning to bud. I've been thinking about expanding the literacy center's mission, not just reading, but family programs, parent-child workshops, prenatal literacy kits. If we can start reading habits before birth, imagine the foundation it builds. Nathaniel grinned. Leave it to you to be building legacies before the baby's even here. Why not? She said with a laugh. Our child is going to grow up surrounded by books. Why shouldn't other children have the same start? The scare. It happened in late April. Elena had been speaking at a local conference on education reform when she suddenly felt a sharp cramp. She excused herself, thinking it was nothing. But when the pain persisted, she called Nathaniel. He arrived within minutes, helping her into the car and driving straight to the hospital. The next few hours were a blur of monitors, hushed conversations, and the sterile smell of antiseptic. Finally, the doctor smiled. The baby's fine. It was likely just dehydration and overexertion, but you need to rest for the next couple of weeks. On the drive home, Nathaniel kept one hand on her knee, the other gripping the steering wheel. You scared me, he admitted. I scared myself, she said softly. I'll slow down, I promise. Choosing peace. For the next month, Eleanor worked from home. Nathaniel moved his office into the dining room so they could share the space. They fell into a gentle rhythm: mornings with coffee and emails, afternoons reading in the library, evenings planning the nursery. It wasn't the high-octane life Nathaniel once thrived on, but he found he didn't miss it. The quiet felt full. One night, as they stood in the half-painted nursery, Nathaniel wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his hands over the curve of her stomach. Whatever happens, he said, this you'll always come first. Elena leaned back against him, her voice barely above a whisper. I know. By the time August arrived, the summer air in San Francisco was warm and heavy with the scent of salt and flowers from their garden. Elena's belly had rounded beautifulully, and Nathaniel couldn't pass her without laying a hand there, as if to reassure himself their child was still growing strong beneath his touch. They had just finished dinner one Thursday evening when Eleanor paused mid-sentence, her fork hovering over her plate. Her face shifted from surprise to discomfort. "What is it?" Nathaniel asked immediately, leaning forward. She took a slow breath. I think my water just broke." From that moment, the house moved into a kind of quiet chaos. Hospital bag grabbed from the nursery. Calls to the doctor. Nathaniel's hands steady, but his pulse hammering. By the time they were in the car, Elena was gripping the door handle, her knuckles white. "I'm all right," she told him between contractions. "But I don't think our little one's going to wait long." The arrival. Labor was long hours marked by the dim light of the delivery suite, the sound of the fetal monitor beeping steadily, and the soft encouragements Nathaniel whispered into Elena's ear. When their child finally came, just after 3 in the morning, the first cry was like nothing Nathaniel had ever heard, piercing and beautiful. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, holding up a tiny, wriggling body before placing her onto Elena's chest. Elena's tears came instantly, her arms curling protectively around their daughter. Nathaniel felt his own vision blur as he touched the baby's dark hair, damp and soft under his fingers. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome home." They named her Amelia Rose Graves. Amelia for Elena's grandmother, Rose for the flowers that filled their garden. A new rhythm. The first weeks at home were a haze of sleepless nights, quiet lullabies, and the unfamiliar but intoxicating scent of their newborn. Nathaniel took a full month away from Hayes Ventures, a decision that made headlines in the business press, but one he didn't think twice about. In the still hours before dawn, he'd walk the floor with Amelia tucked against his chest, her tiny breaths warm through his shirt. Sometimes he'd catch Eleanor watching from the doorway, her smile tired but soft. "You're good at this," she'd whisper. "I've never wanted to be good at anything more," he'd reply. Uninvited advice. Parenthood came with joy but also with opinions, most of them unsolicited. Friends, relatives, even strangers in the park seemed to have firm views on how Amelia should be fed, held, and dressed. The most challenging came from Nathaniel's mother, Victoria Graves, who visited one Saturday afternoon bearing gifts and an air of mild disapproval. "She's beautiful," Victoria said, looking down at her granddaughter, "but I can't help noticing she doesn't have a nanny yet." Elena, who was rocking Amelia in her arms, looked up calmly. "We've decided to care for her ourselves, at least for now." Victoria's eyebrows lifted. "Surely you don't expect to manage without professional help. It's exhausting work, and Nathaniel has a company to run." Nathaniel stepped in before Eleanor could answer. "Mother, we're doing fine. Amelia is our responsibility, and we want these first months to be ours alone." His mother's sigh was subtle but unmistakable. "Just don't run yourselves ragged." When she left, Elena leaned into Nathaniel with a quiet laugh. "I think I passed some kind of Graves family initiation test." "You aced it," he said, kissing her temple. Cracks in the calm, round Amelia's 3rd month, the exhaustion began to wear at them. Nathaniel was easing back into work, balancing investor calls with late-night feedings. Eleanor spent her days in a cycle of feeding, soothing, and trying to snatch short naps between Amelia's unpredictable schedule. One evening, after a particularly hard day where nothing seemed to settle the baby, Eleanor stood in the kitchen staring at a cold cup of tea. "Hey," Nathaniel said gently, coming up behind her. "You okay?" She shook her head, tears brimming. "I love her more than I thought possible, but I'm so tired." "Nathaniel, I feel like I'm losing pieces of myself." He pulled her into his arms. "You're not losing yourself. You're transforming, but I know it's hard. We'll figure out ways to give you breathing space." They began making small changes. Nathaniel took over the morning shift entirely so Elena could sleep, and Elena allowed herself the occasional afternoon away at the literacy center, even if just for a meeting. First laughter. It was a chilly November afternoon when Amelia laughed for the first time. They were on a blanket in the garden, Nathaniel dangling a plush rabbit over her while Elena sat nearby sketching. The laugh was Sudina bubbling, joyous sound that made both of them freeze before breaking into grins. She laughed Elena whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Do it again, Nathaniel said, as if he could command magic on cue. The rabbit danced again, and there it was, another burst of laughter, even brighter than the first. In that moment, the exhaustion, the long nights, the doubts, they all faded under the warmth of that tiny sound, strengthening the bond. Parenthood hadn't dimmed their marriage, it had deepened it. They'd learned to read each other's fatigue, to trade off without keeping score, to find small moments of intimacy in the margins of the day. One night, after Amelia had finally settled into a rare 7-hour stretch of sleep, they curled up on the couch, wine glasses in hand. Do you realize, Eleanor said softly, that a year ago we were just talking about trying for a baby? Nathaniel smiled. And now, I can't imagine a world without her or without you like this. Like this? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Fierce, beautiful, even stronger than the woman I married, which I didn't think was possible. By the end of that first year, they had found a rhythm not perfect, not without its hard days, but theirs. And in the quiet of their home, with Amelia sleeping in the next room, Nathaniel knew that the life they were building was exactly the one he'd been searching for all along. The weeks that followed their return from the small mountain retreat had been a strange mixture of warmth and unspoken tension. Alexander Graves had kept his promise, at least outwardly. He came home earlier than before, no longer burying himself in work until the hours blurred together. Isabella Hartman noticed the subtle changes, the way he lingered at the dinner table to ask about her day, how his hands sometimes found hers when they sat in the garden with coffee in the mornings, the softness that had crept into his voice when he spoke to her. And yet, there was a fragility to this piece. It was as if both of them were walking carefully along the edge of something neither dared to name, afraid that one wrong word might send them tumbling back into the silence they had only just begun to escape. Quiet shifts. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Isabella woke to find Alexander already up. She padded into the kitchen to see him standing by the window, the light from the rising sun catching the sharp line of his jaw. He was pouring coffee into her favorite mug, one she'd chosen from a little ceramics shop in town, because it reminded her of the ocean at dawn. I thought you might like a slow morning, he said without turning. But there was a softness in his tone that pulled her closer. She accepted the mug and leaned against the counter. Thank you. I didn't hear you get up. I couldn't sleep, he admitted, finally meeting her gaze. Too many thoughts. I don't want us to fall back into old habits. She studied him quietly, sensing that there was more behind those words. But she also knew Alexander well enough to understand that pressing too hard too soon would make him retreat. Then let's not, she said simply, taking a sip of coffee. His lips quirked into a half smile, but his eyes were distant. An unexpected visitor. By late afternoon, Alexander had left for a meeting. Isabella decided to take advantage of the rare quiet and immerse herself in the studio. She had been sketching designs for a literacy center program. They discussed her vision of combining his resources with her experience in community work. She was so focused on the curves of her pencil lines that she didn't hear the knock at first. When it came again, more insistent, she set down her pencil and went to the door. A tall man in an immaculate suit stood there, the kind of presence that seemed out of place against the warmth of the home she and Alexander had created. His hair was silver at the temples, his expression unreadable. Miss Hartman, he asked, though it sounded like a statement. Yes. He extended a card. Daniel Carr, I'm Alexander's corporate counsel. I was hoping to speak with him, but since he's out, perhaps I can leave something with you. She hesitated before taking the envelope he offered. It was heavy, the paper thick and expensive. I'll make sure he gets it, she said, but she could feel her pulse quicken. Something about Carr's polite formality, about the faint tension at the corners of his eyes, unsettled her. Thank you, he replied, inclining his head before leaving as quietly as he arrived. The envelope. She didn't open it. She told herself it wasn't her place. But the envelope's presence on the dining table seemed to grow heavier by the hour, as if it carried something that would change the air in the house. When Alexander returned that evening, She handed it to him without comment. He froze for just a fraction of a second before taking it. Daniel stopped by, she said, watching him. Did he say what it was about? Alexander asked, his tone carefully neutral. No, she replied. Should he have? He set the envelope down on the counter without opening it. It's nothing urgent. I'll deal with it later. But Isabella saw the way his hand tightened around the edge of the counter. The way his jaw shifted before he forced his expression smooth again. The call. That night, Alexander stepped outside to take a call. Isabella, curled up on the sofa with a book, heard the low murmur of his voice through the open window. She didn't intend to eavesdrop, but her name caught her attention. No, I haven't told her yet. It's not the right time. I said I'd handle it. Daniel, she doesn't need to be dragged into this. The pause that followed was long. Isabella closed her book, her fingers curling against the fabric of the couch. When he returned, his expression was composed, but there was a tension in his shoulders she hadn't seen in weeks. Everything okay? She asked lightly. Just business, he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. Nothing for you to worry about. Cracks in the calm. The next few days were a study in subtle shifts. Alexander was still there for morning coffee, still interested in her sketches. For the center bit, there was a distance in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Isabella tried to convince herself she was imagining it, that she was simply hyper-aware after everything they had been through. But when she woke in the middle of the night to find his side of the bed empty, she knew it wasn't just her imagination. She found him in the study, the glow of his laptop illuminating the hard lines of his face. He looked up when she stepped into the doorway. Couldn't sleep, she asked softly. Something like that, he replied, closing the laptop more quickly than she expected. She crossed the room and rested her hands on the desk. Alexander, whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. For a moment, she thought he might actually tell her. His eyes searched hers, something raw flickering there bit, then he looked away. Some things are easier if I do, he said quietly. The breaking point. It wasn't until the following Friday that the envelope reappeared. Alexander had been in meetings all day, his replies to her messages short, but not unkind. When he finally came home, he seemed distracted, his tie loosened, his jacket draped carelessly over one arm. I opened it, he said abruptly, as if continuing a conversation they hadn't been having. Isabella frowned. The envelope. He nodded. It's a legal matter. Complicated. Something from before you and I. Her chest tightened. Before us. An agreement. A contract I made years ago. It's come back. She waited, but he didn't elaborate. And you're not going to tell me what it's about. I'm telling you what you need to know, he said, his tone sharper than he intended. What I need to know, she repeated slowly, feeling the ground shift you. He sighed, running are part of your life, she finished for him, and I'm part of your life. Or am I wrong about that? They stood there, the space between them charged and unsteady. The silence between them that night was unlike any they had known before. It wasn't the suffocating silence of resentment that had shadowed their past. It was sharper, taut with questions left unanswered and trust teetering on the brink. Alexander had retreated to the study under the guise of needing to make some calls, and Isabella, too restless to sleep, had sat in the living room staring at the muted glow of the fireplace. She couldn't stop replaying his words. I'm telling you what you need to know. The phrase gnawed at her. She had fought too hard for them to get to a place where they spoke without masks, where neither had to guess at the other's feelings. A fragile morning. By dawn, Isabella had barely slept. She found Alexander in the kitchen, already dressed for the day, pouring himself black coffee as though nothing had happened. Morning, he said, his tone careful, almost testing. Morning, she replied, her voice cold but not cold. He handed her a mug, but when their fingers brushed, she didn't hold his gaze. It was a small thing, but she knew he felt the absence of her usual warmth. About last night, he began. She set the mug down. If you want to talk, talk. If not, don't start a sentence you won't finish. His jaw tightened. It's not that simple. Isabella, it is, she said softly. If we're who we say we are to each other. He exhaled slowly, as if trying to contain something that threatened to spill over. Let me handle this first. Then I'll tell you everything. She nodded once, though it felt like a concession she wasn't sure she should make. An unwelcome echo from the past. That afternoon, Isabella met her friend Leela for coffee at a small cafe near the art supply store. Leela had a knack for sensing when Isabella needed to be coaxed into talking, and today was no exception. You've been quiet, Leela observed, stirring her latte. Quiet for you means something's brewing. It's nothing dramatic, Isabella lied. Leela raised an eyebrow. You're an awful liar when you care about the person you're lying to. Isabella hesitated. There's something Alexander's dealing with, something from his past. He says it's complicated, that he'll tell me when it's safe to. I don't know what that means. Do you trust him? Leela asked. Yes, Isabella said automatically. Then, after a pause, but it's hard to keep trusting when I can feel him pulling away. Lila's expression softened. Sometimes people hold back because they're trying to protect what matters most. But that doesn't mean you have to stop asking for what you need. The words settled in Isabella's mind long after they'd parted ways. Alexander's gamble. Meanwhile, Alexander was in a conference room downtown, his voice low and clipped as he spoke with Daniel Carr and to other men whose expressions revealed nothing. This contract was buried years ago, Daniel was saying. The fact that it's resurfaced now, timing isn't on your side. Alexander's eyes narrowed. What exactly do they want? Technically, they have grounds to enforce the agreement, which means Daniel hesitated. Glancing at the others, they can demand your compliance or make this public. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Public exposure wouldn't ruin him. Nancy Ali's global was too solid for that, but it could tear apart the fragile piece he and Isabella had built. And that was a cost he wasn't willing to pay. I'll pay whatever it takes, he said flatly. It's not just about money, Daniel replied. It's about the story they can spin. The shift. That evening, Alexander returned home earlier than expected. Isabella was in the garden, pruning the roses. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. The late sunlight caught in her hair, and he thought not for the first time how absurd it was that he had ever imagined a life without her. When she looked up, her guarded smile told him she was still hurt. I was thinking, she said before he could speak, maybe we should get away for a few days. Just us. No phones, no meetings. His heart ached at the invitation an olive branch extended even through her uncertainty. I'd like that, he said, but in the back of his mind, he knew that leaving now, before the storm broke, might only postpone the inevitable. The breaking conversation. It happened 2 nights later. They had finished dinner, and Isabella was clearing the plates when Alexander spoke. There's something I need to tell you, he said, his voice low. She set the dishes down, trying her hand slowly. I'm listening. He looked at her for a long moment, as though memorizing the way she stood there, the way her eyes searched his face. Years ago, before you and I signed a binding agreement with someone, it was personal, not business, and it's resurfaced. Her pulse quickened. What kind of agreement? He hesitated, then shook his head. It's complicated, Isabella, but the important thing is, it could affect us, she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, the word hung between them. She swallowed. Then tell me everything. I'd rather hear it from you than from someone else. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I can't, not yet. Something in her chest gave way. Then I don't know how to be in this with you right now, she said quietly. Not if you're going to keep me on the outside. The walk away. Neither of them raised their voice. That almost made it worse. Isabella took a step back, her hands curling at her sides. I love you, Alexander, but love without truth doesn't last. He reached for her, but she shook her head. When you're ready to tell me, you'll know where to find me. She walked upstairs, returning moments later with a small overnight bag. He didn't try to stop her in it because he wanted her to leave, but because he couldn't make himself speak the words that might make her stay. The front door closed softly behind her. Alone, the house felt cavernous after she left. Alexander stood in the kitchen, his hands braced against the counter, the faint scent of her perfume still hanging in the air. He thought of calling her, of driving to wherever she was headed and forcing the conversation they hadn't had, but his instinct, same one that had built empires and ended negotiations, told him she needed space as much as he needed to decide how much of himself he was truly willing to lay bare. Upstairs, in the bedroom they had shared, the space where her books had been stacked neatly on the nightstand now looked achingly empty. The house was too quiet without her. Alexander had always thought of silence as a strategic advantage, a space to think, to plan, to control the narrative. But this was not that kind of silence. This was the absence of her voice drifting from the kitchen, the faint hum of her music while she worked in the garden, the occasional burst of laughter when she was on the phone with Leela. Now there was nothing but the echo of his own thoughts, and every one of them ended in the same place. I should have told her. The call he didn't make. For 2 days, Alexander did not call her. It wasn't out of pride. The pride had been his downfall in the past. It was fear that he would open his mouth and still not be ready to say all of it. Fear that if he reached for her too soon, she would see that he hadn't changed. Instead, he buried himself in meetings and numbers, closing deals as if the sheer force of business could drown out the ache in his chest. But at night, when the city outside his penthouse went quiet, he found himself scrolling to her name in his phone, staring at it until the screen went dark. A conversation he didn't expect. On the third morning, Daniel Carr showed up at his office unannounced. "She left you, didn't she?" Daniel said without preamble, settling into the chair opposite Alexander's desk. Alexander didn't look up from the document in front of him. "She didn't leave me. She took space." Daniel studied him for a long moment. "And you're letting her think the worst while you sit here doing nothing? That's not space, Alex. That's surrender." Alexander's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know what's at stake? I think you're forgetting that this isn't a boardroom," Daniel replied. "You can't just wait for the other party to make the first move. You have to go to her with everything, no filters." Alexander met his friend's gaze and saw no judgment there, only the blunt truth of a man who had watched him fail at this before. "If you don't tell her now, someone else will," Daniel added, "and you won't get to control the way she hears it." The drive. By the time Alexander left the office, the sun was dipping low behind the skyline. He didn't call ahead. He didn't even know if she would be at the place she was staying. But every instinct told him she would be with Leela. Isabella had always found comfort with the people who had known her before him, people who expected nothing but honesty. The drive across the city felt longer than any transcontinental flight he had taken. His grip on the wheel was tight, his mind rehearsing 1,000 versions of the conversation. But the closer he got, the more he realized there was no perfect script. There was only the truth. At the door, Leela opened the door, her expression unreadable. "She's in the back," she said, stepping aside without waiting for him to explain himself. "I'll give you 10 minutes before I decide you've overstayed your welcome." Isabella was sitting on the small patio, a blanket around her shoulders despite the mild evening air. She didn't turn when she heard him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said softly. "I wasn't sure you'd want me to," Alexander replied, stopping a few feet away. She turned then, her eyes guarded. "That depends on why you're here." "The truth, without armor." He sat opposite her, leaning forward, his hands clasped loosely. "The agreement I told you about, it was with someone from my past. Years before you. I made a promission I thought would never matter again, that if certain conditions were met, I would marry her." Isabella's brows drew together. Marry her? It was a strategic alliance at the time, a way to merge two business families. I signed it thinking it would never be called in, but now her family is trying to enforce it, using the terms to push me into a position I don't want to be in, a position I won't be in. She searched his face. "And you didn't tell me because?" Because I didn't want you to think I had ever been the kind of man who saw marriage as a transaction. I didn't want to bring the ugliness into what we have." And his voice faltered for the first time. "Because I was afraid that knowing how reckless I was back then would make you look at me differently." Her expression softened, but she didn't move. "Alexander, I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to be honest. You're not protecting me by holding back, you're protecting yourself." He nodded slowly. "You're right, and I hate that it took you leaving for me to see that. The question that mattered." He took a deep breath. "I don't want to fight to protect an empire. It costs me you. I've already started the process of voiding that agreement, no matter the fallout. But I need to know, do you still want to be here with me, even knowing what I've told you?" Her eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't." Relief washed through him so strongly it left him momentarily breathless. He reached across the small table, and this time, she didn't hesitate. Her hand slid into his, warm and certain. Coming home that night, Isabella returned to the house with him. The moment they stepped inside, Alexander felt the air shift, not because the tension was gone, but because they had decided to face it together. In the days that followed, he kept his word. Every meeting, every document, every conversation tied to severing the old agreement, he shared with her. And with each step, the invisible wall between them thinned until it was gone entirely. 6 months later, the final legal notice arrived on a clear spring morning. The agreement is void. Alexander had thought he would feel triumphant. Instead, he felt only gratitude, because the real victory was that Isabella was there when he read it, her hand in his, both of them smiling at the same thought. We're free. They celebrated that night in the garden. Just the two of them, a bottle of wine open between them. The air smelled of jasmine, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. "To the past," Alexander said, raising his glass, "and never letting it dictate our future." "To the truth," Isabella replied, clinking her glass against his, "and to choosing each other every single day. A future built on trust." By the end of the year, the life they had imagined in fragments began to take full shape. Isabella launched a small art and literacy program in the city, and Alexander redirected part of his company's profits to fund it. They traveled not to escape, but to experience the world together. And every night, no matter where they were, they talked about fears, about dreams, about the little, ordinary moments that made up the real fabric of their lives. One evening, as they watched the sun sink below the horizon from their balcony, Alexander looked at her and said quietly, "I used to think power was the ability to control everything. Now I know it's the ability to stand here with you and not need to control anything at all." She smiled, leaning into him. "That's because you finally understand the only thing worth holding onto is each other." 5 years later, the house in Pacific Heights looked much the same, from the street warm lights spilling from the windows in the evenings, ivy curling along the garden walls, but inside, the rhythm of life had deepened. The art and literacy program Isabella had started in the city had grown into 3 thriving community centers, each one buzzing with children painting in bright colors and adults learning to read their first books. Her name was spoken with quiet admiration in neighborhoods far from the glossy districts Alexander's business once dominated. Alexander's empire still stood, stronger than ever, but it moved differently now. Sustainability, community investment, and education were no longer bullet points in an annual report, they were the core. Shareholders sometimes grumbled at the slower, more deliberate growth, but Alexander no longer measured success in quarterly returns. At home, the couple's life was stitched together from the ordinary moments they had once feared they might never share. Sunday mornings in the kitchen with music playing low, evenings spent in the garden reading aloud to each other, long walks through the city without an agenda. And there were new additions to that rhythm: a little boy with Isabella's dark eyes who loved to sit on Alexander's lap while he read aloud, and a baby girl with a laugh so bright it made strangers smile on the street. One warm summer evening, Alexander stood in the garden, watching Isabella kneel among the roses with their son, showing him how to prune without hurting the stems. Their daughter babbled in his arms, tugging at the collar of his shirt. He caught Isabella's eye across the flowers, and in that moment amid the scent of roses, the low hum of the city beyond, and the two small lives they had created, Alexander felt the same quiet certainty he'd felt the day she came back to him. Some things are worth risking everything for, and the truth they had chosen all those years ago had built them something better than either could have imagined, a life they would never have to walk away from again.